Hey there, everyone. My name is Craig Wilson,
And I'm Jessica Jasper.
and we are both the doctoral candidates in cohort 7 of Baylor's online EDD program. And this is Ethics in Action. This is our first video podcast where we're going to be describing and exploring some ethical dilemmas. So, the purpose of our project is to explore ethical dilemmas that maybe have most recently occurred. And in our context, we're going to be focusing on recent issues that face school administrators and school board members and the potential impact that that might have on the community. So throughout this video podcast, we're going to first define what determines an ethical dilemma, who might be at stake. We're going to look at some of the frameworks that we used as we started exploring our ethical dilemma, and we're going to suggest some solutions. So we're going to, throughout this thing, we're going to cite some relevant resources, and we're going to use real life scenarios to anchor our research and our solutions. But before we get too much further on, first we need to define what an ethical dilemma is. Jessica, you want to tell us about an ethical dilemma and define it for us?
Absolutely. So, according to our rubric, an ethical dilemma occurs when an ethical actor faces a decision and every available course of action will lead to compromising the actors and or stakeholders' principles in some way. So, it's almost like it's not a black and white issue. It's very gray. And it leaves the ethical actor to determine how best to resolve the dilemma while mitigating the impact.
Okay, you had mentioned something about an actor and a stakeholder. Can you help define what each one of those players are?
Sure. So, in my view, an ethical actor is the decision maker. They're the ones who are going to ultimately have to make that decision when they are faced with an ethical dilemma. And weigh those pros and cons to figure out what is the best way to move forward. The stakeholders are going to be the ones most impacted by the decision by the ethical actor.
So you kept mentioning the word impact. So we're not talking about whether I should go have chicken for lunch or pizza for lunch. We're not talking about those kind of simple decisions. We're talking about things that impact our community, our society.
Absolutely. And when we see these impacts, it can impact the quality of life. When we're looking at employees, it can look at how they even view and trust their organization. Um, it really gets to the core of how these stakeholders go about their daily lives.
So I imagine an ethical dilemma can be something small or it can be really major and have a large impact that'll be moving to the future, can have some very large ramifications.
Absolutely. Depending on what the ethical dilemma is, it can even, go to life and death when we're looking at things like military or medical research. For us, ours is not quite life and death, but it does tinge on quality of life, I would say.
Sounds good. Wow. Okay. Well, so let's get into one of the more recent dilemmas, ethical dilemmas that we're facing in public education, and that's the use of social media, not by kids, but by adults. Kids, that's a whole nother story. So let's talk about our personal experiences with being educators in social media. Jessica, you want to start out?
Sure. So I think it's very interesting with social media. And I know personally, I have a personal Facebook that my privacy settings are private. It is not public. I also have an Instagram for my dog. But I do actually have a required Twitter for work. We are required to have a Twitter account to tweet out all the good things that are going on in our district. However, it's really interesting, especially with some recent elections and bond elections. We were explicitly instructed on our Twitter account that we cannot follow any political organizations or somebody who might be considered controversial on Twitter account. We cannot have any sort of visible political leanings because that is considered a professional account.
Okay.
How about you, Craig?
Similar. I do have my own Facebook and Twitter account, my personal one, and then I also do have an Instagram account, but my wife gets on me because I never use it. I'm just not an Instagrammer or grammer, whatever they call it, an Insta-er. But similar to you, in my role now as a new principal in the school district, I'm expected as well to keep some professional social media accounts. So I have a Twitter account, an Instagram account, and a Facebook account. What's interesting though is the way Facebook works. If you want to create, like for me, it's from my school page. It actually is attached to my personal Facebook account. There's no way to do it as just a business account on Facebook. They don't want you to do that. But what's interesting is when I signed on to this job a few months ago, I had to sign a social media contract. And within that contract, it says that I am a role model for my school district. Whether I have a personal page or a professional page, it is supposed to be acted with professionalism. And in fact, I can face consequences if on my personal accounts, there's something that may reflect negatively in the profession and on my school district. So we were warned that anything that we post personally is considered professional as well. Now, I've always been very careful about that anyways, but I can imagine somebody who might be new to the district or young, and maybe they've had a Facebook account forever and they've got those postings on there from when they were in college, that could impact their job. It can impact their I mean, whether it's a termination or whether it's something punitive. So that's kind of interesting. But in fact, one of the research I looked up, a guy named Chris Frost, and he says that public figures should understand that they have a limited expectation for privacy. We put ourselves out there in the public domain, and we should expect criticism for it. So I can understand the viewpoint of the school district for doing that. So you found some research too, though, from the Pew Center, didn't you?
Yes, the Pew Research Center, what they found on their social media fact sheet was just a little over half of employees reported an existence of employer rules kind of governing their social media use during work hours. And that 32% of these employees are subjected to employer policies on how they conduct themselves on the internet in general. Which I find really interesting because we have that line between professional and personal starting to be crossed. And we actually in our class had a survey of our classmates asking them, about their professional roles to see. And it was very similar. About half of the people in our class that responded to the survey said, yes, they do have roles. But I think what's more interesting is that 17% were not sure, which could be concerning if you don't know, if you're not aware of what social media roles exist. And then going in line with that, for those that do have the roles, over 2/3 said they don't feel like it censors them, but that still leaves 30% of the respondents from our class survey who feel like it does censor them, those roles that their company is placing on them.
Yeah. And recently we've been talking in our class about having codes of ethics. And I wonder if that's even addressed in codes of ethics, because a lot of times those just get put on a shelf and they're not updated recently. So I wonder if those 17% that aren't sure, maybe it's just because either they haven't gone back to look at the code of ethics, or maybe it's just not even in there. So that in itself could be an ethical dilemma. So
our ethical dilemma that we're looking at really today is how public officials, in our case, because we're in education, that district and school leadership, censoring guest speakers, employees based on their personal views versus extending that right to freedom of speech. So really looking at that decision as a school leader to deny value to the staff or students due to the person or the organization's personal viewpoint as they've expressed in social media based on their extended freedom of speech. So in other words, for public entities that do receive government funds, that ability to say, no, we don't agree with this, kind of the values that they're expressing through the censoring.
So in our real life scenario that we're going to, or scenarios that we're going to talk about here in just a moment, we're going to talk about how that extension of the social media limitations is not necessarily just within the organization, but also extends to their guests.
Correct.
All right. Thanks. So now let's get into the fun stuff. Let's actually bring up some real life examples. So you and I are going to describe 3 different examples that we've encountered recently. And then after that, we'll go in and we'll talk about what ethical frameworks are and how these fit into our ethical frameworks. Sounds good?
Sounds great.
Okay. So, and recently, recently, as far as like this year,
January.
January, Katy Independent School District, which is just northwest of in the greater Houston area, denied a writer named Emma Straub the ability to come to their district and read to kids. Now, Emma Straub usually is an adult writer, but she did write a children's book, and she was invited to come into Katy ISD and explore her book with students at schools. However, Emma Straub was very vocal on her personal Twitter page, tweeting about the way the Uvalde shooting was handled. In fact, she was very vocal about it to the point where she was using words and expletives and pejoratives about the entire situation.
It was cursing. It was very, very explicit.
Very explicit. Yes, she was very explicit in her language. And And what happened is at least one parent, if not several parents, got wind of that, and they did not feel that that was acceptable to bring in somebody who used that language into the schools. They went to the board. They complained about using inappropriate language regarding that shooting, and the district uninvited her to come and to speak. So they contended that the author's language did not align with the district's value. And this was all from an article that we found, I believe it was from the Houston Chronicle from Garcia. And we'll show up on the screen, we'll superimpose what she actually said. So that was the first dilemma. You want to talk about another one?
Sure. So this is something that actually happened within the school district I currently work in last summer. We had invited, and when I say we, a department had invited personal learning guru Paul Emmerich France, an author, to come and speak at our personalized learning conference. And a parent went and searched for what we call, I guess now, doxing, which is a term where they go and look for personal information, and found out that he was he's gay. He does not hide that fact. He's married to a man. He is a member of the ASCD, and they got very upset, calling it woke indoctrination. Not necessarily the book, but because he talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that she did not want this woke author coming to our school district. And then speaking with somebody who from that department who did not want to be named, fear of repercussions, but she did tell me that that whenever the solution to it was that he could not mention that he was gay, he could not mention anything about equity, diversity, or inclusion during his keynote speech or any subsequent sessions. And he was actually babysat through each of the sessions by one of our chief officers to make sure that Paul did not mention this. And Paul felt that, in a sense, that he was having to balance: should I compromise my values? Or, should I go through and show, like, no, you're not going to take, you're not going to affect me this way. You're not going to cancel me. But it was just a really interesting situation in our district where these parents did show up to the board to complain about this author and how they came up with a very quiet solution to the problem.
A very quiet solution. I like how you said that. So All right, and I've got one more real life example. So within my own school district, we're doing some leadership studies with some of our aspiring leaders. And the book that they're using for that is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. The book in itself is fine and it's great. I love the book. I subscribe to it myself. However, when listening to her podcasts or listening to her as a guest on other podcasts, which is a form of social media, she uses very real and sometimes salty, sometimes unprofessional language. She does curse. She does take jabs at political figures, particularly conservative political figures, when she is speaking. And so in my district right now, it hasn't been addressed yet. However, I can very easily see either a parent or perhaps even one of the members of the aspiring leadership group coming in and saying, should we be allowing this person in when you have to censor her podcast anyways for us, or you have to censor some of her writings because of some of the language that's unprofessional? Someone might become offended by that language that she uses. And so again, there's that doxing and perhaps the opportunity to cancel her because of her social media, because of her real life views. So it's interesting. I wonder, what may happen if somebody down the road does get offended by some of the language she uses or some of her political ideology and asks the district to stop. And even
And,
though she may have value.
and what's really interesting with all three of these is that while they are all different, they all kind of share the similarity that that they may offend someone, and therefore, it's not suitable for consumption by educational leaders.
Mm-hmm. And so it makes you wonder, as a political figure, going back to that Frost's idea that, you're expected a limited amount of privacy, is the idea here that, education needs to be sheltered and protected from real life, or should it be something that allows people to explore what real life is going to be about? Mm-hmm. So in our next segment, we're going to be talking about these three issues in particular, and we're going to be looking at them through ethical frameworks, and we're going to talk about some potential solutions and some of the compromises that might need to be met. All right, so in this segment, what we're going to talk about is what ethical frameworks we considered when we were thinking about, in this case, social media and its impact on public education. So we're going to look at three different frameworks. And so let's analyze. So I'm going to start with the first one. And this comes from what's called we looked at different ethical framework perspectives, and that's in our book that's written by Johnson from 2021. So I'm going to go back to, before we get into the first one, I'm going to get back to the issue we were talking about with a man named Gordon, and he talks about the dangers of canceling in the educational environment. So, and he gives 5 potential negative consequences of canceling. In our case, should Emma Straub be allowed to come in? Should French be allowed to come in? What about reading Brene Brown? What about Kirk Cameron? He's pretty conservative in his views, and I know that he's been not allowed to come into certain school districts, especially in liberal California. So he talks about 5 different potential consequences from canceling. First, it limits the information and it can reinforce skewed viewpoints. So he calls this epistemic closure and confirmation bias. So if you limit those views, hey, you can control and you can reinforce that groupthink. Second, it limits debate on differences to change behaviors, which is essential to our democracy. So if you don't bring in other viewpoints, then democracy can become stagnant and it can actually start going in a bad direction. Third, those available viewpoints become dogmatic and they lack differentiating opinions to advance society. Dogmatic. This is how we do it. This is how we're going to do it. And that becomes your mind frame. Fourth, it suppresses minority and controversial views. So, and when we're talking about minority, we're not talking about just marginalized members of our community, but we're just talking about a differentiated opinion. In our case, it could be sexual orientation, or it could be political leanings. And finally, cancellation can result in a false sense of consensus, limiting the need for honest discussions and change. So if you don't bring in those viewpoints into an organization, in our case, into a school district, well, then you don't have to worry about, I mean, it looks like everybody agrees because we don't bring in those views. And so you don't need that honest discussion and change. And that's not necessarily where we want to go. So let's talk about some of the different frameworks. In this case, I'm going to talk about what's called utilitarianism. And the idea of utilitarianism is that you're going to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And what utilitarianism is dealing with more than it's dealing with the good of everyone. And so it's the ethical framework of looking at the group in general, not necessarily an individual. And there's 4 different steps that can be applied that Johnston talks about when we conduct this analysis. One is, let's clearly identify what the issue could be. Let's specify everyone who might be impacted by our decision. Let's determine those likely consequences. And then when we have all that information together, let's sum up and let's look at the balance between good and bad consequences and which one outweighs the other. So it really is a pretty thorough analysis before you make your ethical decision. Jessica, you want to talk about the next one?
Sure. So the next framework that we're kind of viewing this through is justice as fairness. And I think that this is really interesting because, you know, we are kind of looking at this through the free speech amendment and that right. And so with this justice as fairness, according to Johnson, we have to look at how the 2 principles of justice may apply to this situation. The first principle, each person has an equal right to the same basic liberties, and they're compatible with similar liberties. And then the next principle is that the social and economic inequalities are to satisfy the 2 conditions of they're able to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity, and they are able to provide the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. And that's on page 151 of our text. So kind of going back, I had to do some research into the legal aspect of this and how it might apply to this situation. And we kind of touched on it earlier. And what some of the research, Heidi from 2021 contends that free speech is, quote, the architecture of a free society, that ability to speak freely, speak your mind. But when this free speech is exercised and an individual or group is disagreeing with another, which we see a lot today going on, this can lead to what is called cancel culture. And this cancel culture breeds intolerance and can damage the democratic society. And she likened the use of companies' policing of employees' social media to McCarthyism. So kind of going back, almost a century ago, and that an employee's fear of punishment based on their company's social media policies kind of places these limits on their perceived freedom. So while it may not actually exist, they kind of live in a fear to post their personal views on social media, resulting in kind of a self-censorship encouraged by employers. So if employees do post viewpoints contrary to cultural norms, they risk public scrutiny and possibly loss of employment. And we saw that even recently with the cartoonist for Dilbert. While it was racist, did he have that right to free speech to say that? And as a result, he was canceled. We have to acknowledge that the First Amendment guarantees protections from the government. However, Heino, also from 2021, says these protections do not extend to private companies and their employees. So essentially, employers have the ability to hold employees accountable for their social media postings. So when we go back to that sense of justice, when we're looking at it, they do have the right to free speech from the government. That is that legal framework. We do have that, but they do not have that right to free speech in a sense where they can say whatever they want and not expect it to impact them professionally.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, before you move on to the next framework, this is, when we're talking about this justice is fairness and we're talking about a protected free speech, what's interesting is in our current social situation here, the ethical dilemma is not being created by a government entity, but it's being created by society at large. You know what I'm saying? Because a lot of this, what we call cancel culture, that's not the government. The government is not trying to govern, or trying to curtail free speech, but it's actually members of our society that are doing that and using the power of social media to limit people's free speech.
You're absolutely right. And what they're doing and what we're seeing in our roles is that they're going out and they are finding things that they may disagree with. And now they're taking it back to bringing it back to us, bringing it back to educational leaders, board members. Those ethical actors are going to have to make these decisions. They're complaining. And that is what is creating this ethical dilemma. And it's creating this, how do we balance? How do we balance, what different groups are demanding of us?
And it's interesting.
And that's really interesting because that's going to lead us into our last framework to kind of go through this. The pragmatism, ethics as inquiry. And what I really like about this is we perform a dramatic rehearsal, a what if situation. I call it future casting, where we have to, if we do this, what's going to happen? And Frost in 2020, he kind of approached privacy from the position of a journalist. He contended that public figures can expect reduced levels of privacy. And while that obviously includes entertainers, our actors, and musicians, politicians, he also says it includes those who have responsibility to the public, such as educators. And it really raises an interesting question if there's an invasion of privacy, if the person is a public interest, because he's saying, no, it's not. We as a public person, we can't have an expectation to privacy. And so looking at that what if we, cancel a speaker, what is that impact? If we allow the speaker with no caveats, we're just going to let them come and we're not going to put any limitations on their speeches, how is that going to impact us? And then, lastly, allowing a speaker, but putting some conditions into place to kind of protect people, what would that impact be? And that's actually looking at that pragmatism. We're going to be using that to go through our solutions.
Sounds good.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about this pragmatism and really go through a dramatic rehearsal where I give a scenario that we would encounter as educational leaders, likely. And we are going to take this approach of pragmatism to this ethical dilemma, and we're going to approach it, but we're really going to immerse ourselves in the details of this dilemma, the what ifs, and kind of go through and, well, if we did this, this might happen, and really that trickle down effect as we go through and try to figure out what might happen. And that requires us to really engage our imagination, acknowledge our limitations. We may not have all the answers, but we have to be able to look at things from different perspectives and look for these creative solutions. And embrace our emotions, but also be able to recognize the emotional investment that our stakeholders might have in each solution as well.
And then we'll take that pragmatic idea, and then we're going to layer it on top of the perspective of utilitarianism, which, as a reminder, is doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So I think what we'll do is, again, here in just a moment, we're going to clearly define what our issue is. We're going to talk about everyone that's going to be impacted by that decision. We're going to look at some of those consequences, both the good consequences and the bad consequences. Then from that, we're going to have to come up with a solution. So we're going to balance the good versus the bad and then come up with an answer. Does that sound right?
Sounds perfect. And so the scenario that we are going to look at, and this is talking, taking our ethical dilemma and basically giving it a face, giving it some personality, this idea of being canceled. So let's give us imagination as educational leaders. We have our library, our media specialists, as they're called now. They have decided they want to bring in guest authors, Justin Richardson and Peter Parnell, who wrote the book back about 20 years ago in 2005, and Tango Makes Three. And so this book is based on a real story of two penguins at a zoo, two male penguins who bonded and adopted a hatchling. I do want to preface this by saying Justin Richardson and Peter Parnell are a married couple with a daughter as well. And so they wrote this book that showed two male penguins that adopt a baby penguin. This book has won many awards, but it also has a dubious honor of being one of the most banned children's books in the United States. And so taking this book, we're not going to focus on, canceling the book or the book ban itself, but we want to focus on, okay, so we've had these two people. They appeared on social media, on a YouTube. You can see it. It's called the My Big Gay Fiction Podcast. And they talk about their book, and they also, Justin wrote a satirical piece in the Washington Post about this situation in the Florida area. So basically painting this movement in Florida by the right as fear mongers. So now I want you to imagine parents are upset because they feel like they're being painted as in an unfair light just because they may object to the content of the book. It may feel like it violates their religious views. So now we have this. They're upset about their comments on the Big Gay Fiction Podcast. They're upset that they wrote this satirical piece that is essentially mocking the movement in Florida, and they do not want them presenting and talking to their children. What do we do?
Yeah. So we're going to take this from the standpoint of you and I are school administrators, and what do? Library media specialist has recommended that has asked these authors to come in, and word's gotten out and the community is upset. So how do we handle it? All right, well, here we are. Let's talk about some of the solutions that we're going to come up with. So we're going to unpack each one separately. So just to front load, our solutions could be either deny or cancel our guest authors altogether. Solution 2 could be let them come in unfettered and do their thing. Or solution 3 might be a compromise. So let's go through each one of them, starting with denying or canceling the speaker. So first, let's define who the ethical actors might be in this, in all three of these scenarios. So our first ethical actor would be the school board. So we have to remember that, especially here in Texas, the school board are elected by their community stakeholders. So they probably have some kind of a responsibility to represent the values of those people who elected them. They, just like any elected political figure, they are supposed to represent their community. But maybe...
However, though, school boards are supposed to be nonpartisan.
in theory, right? They are supposed to be nonpartisan. But also, since they are part of a school and school board, do they have the responsibility to advance societal and community and cultural issues as well? So that's one of our ethical actors. The other one might be us, the district, and the school leadership. So same kind of questions. Are we supposed to be representing our community culture? Or are we supposed to be acting within the accordance with our state expectations, especially here in Texas right now? There's a large movement, just like there is in Florida, to basically squash or quash anything that has to do with outside of traditional social values. So our current climate right now is very charged. Or are we also supposed to be supporting democratic and social justice and social changes? So those are our ethical actors. You want to talk a little bit about maybe who our stakeholders might be?
Sure. So first and foremost, I think our stakeholders are going to be our students and our teachers. And when we talk about students, it's giving, we're limiting potentially their access to different perspectives. Teachers, their scope of teaching, our librarians, does banning of authors, are we starting to equate this also with banning of books? Is it, I don't like your personal views, so therefore your book is banned? And then self-censoring those guest authors as well. I think a huge group, because a lot of our schools are such huge, centers in our community, of course, is the community members. Our families send their children to school, so that those morals and beliefs, faith and ethics that are represented by the different types of families that attend our schools, and then of course the authors and illustrator, and looking at how it might limit promotion or even raise awareness of a book, depending on the media traction it gets, and their ability to earn a living.
Mm-hmm. I think back to those community members, in particular families. Part of right now what we're seeing in our society is, do schools have the right to force an ideology or a perspective upon students, or is that the parents' right to do that as well? I come from a potentially conservative and traditional background myself. I was raised that way, and I can imagine that parents also may feel a little challenged when they send their children off for most of their waking hour to a different environment that might be teaching them that something different than their ideological beliefs as well.
That's true, but we also have to remember that our families are made up of all types of different families these days. And is it fair for these, like, the only representation that they see is a nuclear white family with a mom and a dad, 2.5 siblings, and a cute little dog? Is that our families? What about the children who have an absentee father? Should they have no representation of single mothers? Our families, like in this, that have two male penguins, that alludes to the idea of a family with two male fathers. Should those be represented as well?
So talk a little bit about, so in solution one, if we're talking about just completely denying and canceling the authors, whether it's because, whatever the reasons might be, but what would be the impact, do you think, of doing that?
Well, I think one of the foremost is that we're making this decision for them. We're removing the access to them. Of course, we did provide the access to begin with, technically, by inviting the authors, our librarians inviting the authors. But then we're also now removing that access as well, and not allowing families to make that decision for themselves. However, for me, I think the most powerful impact is the messaging it sends. Mm-hmm. And it can just be because of where, my personal values. And I see this, like, I imagine the hurt it would, that it might give to our students who come from families where you have same-sex parents, or they themselves might identify as part of that LGBTQ community, and if we're saying no, we're not going to have you, because you're speaking out against these bills, and you're making, you're in a sense mocking them, but because you're speaking out, we don't want you because you don't represent us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that say to them?
Yeah, no, I agree. So if we're going to ban, if solution one is to ban the authors and potentially the illustrator, if he were to come as well, let's talk about the strengths and the weaknesses just of that scenario. So I think one of the strengths could be, from an elected official's point of view, is you're not allowing controversy to come in. Therefore, you're going to represent your voter base and potentially get reelected. I know that sounds self-serving, but that's the reality. The reality,
out of sight, out of mind.
People want to be reelected. As a school administrator, I'm not inviting controversy in. I don't have to worry about that potential backlash, right?
But I think that's also a weakness, because I think sometimes now you're inviting a different type of controversy.
Right.
Because you're going to be known as the Don't Say Gay school,
Right.
The district, and that is a totally different controversy. So it's a trade-off. You're making somebody happy, but now you're upsetting another base.
So I think we both agree that that wouldn't be a solution that we would go with banning and canceling the entire.
Personally, I could never agree to that solution myself.
Yeah, I agree. So let's swing the pendulum all the way to the other side. Let's say that we're just going to allow the authors to come in, no holds barred. There's no caveats, no asterisks. They're just allowed to come in and do their thing. Now, we're not saying that Richardson and Peter, oh gosh, his last name just Parnell. We're not saying that they would do this. Well, let's just say that they came in and they're frustrated with the whole situation, and they see this as an opportunity to just completely spill their ideology. Let's talk about it. We've already talked about who the actors and the stakeholders are. So let's just jump straight into the strengths, the weaknesses, the impact this would have.
Well, to just be able to speak freely, while in theory it sounds beautiful, again, we have to deal with controversy. I think that would be a huge impact in that, is, that, what they say could be, offensive, not just to one group, but multiple groups. And now you're being held liable for it. And you're going to now be in the media. And I think of that, the public image and just the damage it could do short-term, long-term, to the image for the district, for the leadership for that.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I think it's the flip side of the same coin, right? That it versus the banning versus the total unbridled. You're going to bring in controversy no matter what, either way. And I can imagine, as if this were like at my school as a principal and somebody were to come on and to go on a tirade about a particular viewpoint, that could get real touchy, especially with, depending on the age of the children and the maturity level, to be able to understand what the authors might be talking about.
Absolutely. And especially for people who maybe, like when we think about like going back to Emma Straub, who's traditionally written more young adult or adult literature to do children, could there be an oops moment,
Right.
Or Brene Brown, she doesn't seem like she censors herself a lot.
No,
and for adults, it's not such a, as big of a deal. Hopefully, people aren't as easily offended, but you never know. You never know.
So as we went through this, we identified the issues, we identified the impact, we identified the actors and the stakeholders. And now we're coming up to the part where in utilitarianism, where we have to balance the good versus the not so good, and what path are we going to take? And we decided that neither one of those, either the utter denial or the utter openness, are probably not the best solution. So I think we've come up with a compromise. So let's get into what that compromise might be. So we think that we would allow the authors to come in, but we are going to put some limits, some parameters around their visits. Can we talk about what some of those parameters might be?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's very common to have contracts with these authors. And so, this could be a part of that. But basically, where we call them caveats for this. And this allows for them to speak. But so, for example, in this case, if we had Justin Richardson and Peter Parnell coming in, we would want parent permission, especially if interacting with staff and interacting with students, and then also make it optional for staff to attend if it was, say, something more in terms of professional learning. But by getting parent permission, we're giving power to parents, but we're also allowing, we're not limiting the speaker's ability to reach the audience if parents so wish it. However, we would also have to have those kind of caveats in terms of a contract, that certain things, like what is the purpose of this? Is the purpose of this to make political statements about, or is it to promote our book, read our book, and talk about our two penguins, and the great story that is, but not necessarily get into making political statements that I don't agree with this bill, and, time and place.
And I think that also promotes a level of transparency with the community as well, because you're saying, we want your children to have the opportunity to see different viewpoints. However, you have that ultimate choice. But instead of trying to sneak this under, and not let anybody know about it, we're being wide open about it. We're saying, here's our idea, but the transparency also comes with, but we're also going to, limit some of what the author may or may not want to speak about. I think also it creates a policy for future guest speakers. I think that, that would allow your media specialist or whomever else might want to bring in a guest, whether it's a guest speaker for a book or a guest speaker from one of your civic organizations or whatever, but it kind of sets a precedent for this is how we interact with our community.
Yes, and again, it sets those precedents, those expectations, and any speaker or author also has a choice. They do not have to agree to do a speaking engagement, transactional. They don't have to. Especially if it doesn't align to the values. And the example that I used earlier with my district, he made that choice. He had the option to, of course, back out. We understood, and he had to think about it. To make that choice. And ultimately he's like, I'm not going to let them, take my voice away. Sure. I'll do this, and so I think giving them that option as well.
Sure. And so when we talk about that contract or that pact that we would enter in with a guest coming into our community, some of the reasons we do that, is to limit liability or maybe limit exposure to controversy. I mean, that would be one of the reasons. Let's talk, though, about contingency plans. Let's talk about what happens if we bring in a guest, but in bad faith, they begin to work outside of that agreement. What are some things at our disposal? What can we do to limit our liability?
Well, I mean, I think if they're up on stage and they're already, speaking, you're in the oops, as I like to say, you're there. But being able to quickly, having a contingency plan, to make sure that I hate to say the word stifle the voice, but if it's not inappropriate, we got to get them off.
Yeah.
Um,
The metaphorical hook off the stage, get them
the
off
mic,
really
cut the mic, no sound. I think of that Forrest Gump moment where he starts talking about it and they cut the mic because they don't want anybody to hear it. And it kills me to say it, but again, it's liability. And as a leader, you may not necessarily agree with it, but it's not about you. You have to think about the organization at large, the community at large, all the stakeholders, because ultimately it's not about you.
Right. And I think one of the compromises here that we made also is, creating that agreement before we even get started. That way, as you said before, the author has the opportunity to review the agreement, or whoever the guest speaker is has the opportunity to review the agreement and agree or not agree to the terms. But there also might be some things in there for those consequences, for those contingencies. So if you act out of bad faith outside of those parameters, understand that there's going to be consequences. It could be refusal to pay. We're not going to pay for your invitation if you were paid. It could be reference checks. If somebody were to ask us, would you invite this author again? Probably not. Or this guest speaker again? Probably not. So I think we came up with a good compromise. So
I agree. I think it's going to be the one that, looking at it through that utilitarianism framework, that you're going to make the most people happy. Nobody's going to be 100% happy. And like I said earlier, it's a gray area. You can't have it, when you have these ethical dilemmas. There's no way to have everybody 100% happy 100% all the time. It does require a compromise.
Well, and if it made everybody happy, it wouldn't be an ethical dilemma, right?
Right.
Jessica, I think we've had a great podcast. We've gone through some great ideas. I appreciate your time. I hope that whoever's listening to us has an opportunity to take a lot of what we said to heart and maybe be able to employ some of these perspectives and frameworks themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm just happy that we can talk about something that is so relevant to our work today. Something that, I think at some point, we're going to have to face, either you as a leader in a district or myself as somebody who does speak. You never know what I may face. Although I have a limited digital footprint, I will say that. Still outspoken.
All right. Again, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.